Speaker will be Daniel Assisi with his talk entitled Education, an Act of Love. Daniel Assisi has spoken on spirituality and Spiritism throughout the U.S. and abroad, and has also been an active participant in the Spiritist movement in California for over 15 years. Passionate about education, Dr. Assisi works with public schools and education reforms in California and holds a doctorate degree in education and a master's in public administration with a graduate certificate in public policy from the University of Southern California. Daniel lives in San Diego with his wife, Nicole, and his son, Dave.
Good afternoon. It's a pleasure being here. I blame Aristotle. I blame Aristotle because although he has given us many great advancements in scientific knowledge, one of the things he did was to divide the sciences at the time, or at least philosophy, to get to a point that we can branch them into smaller fields of study so that we can go deeper into them. And by going deeper into them, we could specialize and focus on them. And an unhappy byproduct of that was, with time, we have focused so much on them that sometimes we lose sight of how they connect back into the whole. So what we hope to do today is to try to connect that back into the whole. And by that is, we talk about education. Education is an act of love. And I want to argue today with you that, in fact, education and love are indistinguishable from each other. That you cannot have love without a very large educational component, and that you cannot have education without some love. I want us to remind us of that today, and I'm going to try to do that. And I also want to try to have us shift our mental posture so we not only think of education, as we normally do, which is something that helps us prepare for this physical life, to remind ourselves that we are spirits too, and think of it as something that prepares us to not only thrive in this life, but in the many more lives to come. And I hope to do that in all 30 minutes. That's going to be hard. We're going to try at least. Can't blame us for trying. So I'm going to ask you to fasten your spiritual seatbelts, hang into this bumpy ride, because we're going to go fast. How does that sound? All right. And to do that, I want to first revisit the concept of education as we see it today, then perhaps talk about how we originally meant it, and then bring forth 4 different educators that can teach us a powerful lesson on how to look at education and help ourselves get to that point. And if we get there, then maybe at the end, we'll be able to have a different perspective and help ourselves connect love to education and spirituality. So far, so good? So I want to start by going to that common experience we all have of education. All of us here share something in common. We went to school or received an education. We all had experiences. We might remember the smell of our cafeteria or our crayons, on how our school looked and what kind of teachers really made an impact in our lives because they were so fantastic or so horrible. Regardless, we remember them. We had that common perspective. And in great part, if we are here today and you understand what I am saying, is because a teacher helped you. And so we want to acknowledge teachers everywhere as the most important part of our education. And remind ourselves that truly we could not be here without them. But if education worked well for all of us, we should also point out that today in our society, things are a little bit different. And we should also say really quickly that education has been deemed so important by all of us as a society that we have decided as a society, through our government, to provide education to all our citizens and in fact make it mandatory. That's how much our society values education. So we all agree on that. But we have some alarming numbers to share today. Things are different. I don't know if you know this, but at every 26 seconds, a student drops out of high school in the United States. To put that in perspective, one student will drop out every 26 seconds. Think about this. In 30 minutes, in the time that I'm speaking here to you, about 150 students would have dropped out of high school. That is to say, the whole auditorium of 150 people here today would have literally walked out of this auditorium 26 seconds at a time. I'm not asking you to do that, please. Stay. That's why I had you fasten your seatbelts. They're still there. You can't leave. Just kidding. But you get the idea. It's a powerful vision. Look around. That's a lot of people. And we ought to do better. That is equivalent of 7,000 a day, 1.2 million kids a year. Education is so important to our society that these numbers have a really delicate and powerful effect. If we talk about physical terms, it has an impact on our economies. If you look at California, for instance, since we're here in California, I want to share with you some numbers. That red line that you see in the graph is the amount of money that it takes to educate a student from K to 12 in the public system, around $125,000 if the student graduates on time. We also know through research that depending on the number of years in schooling that we have, that affects our earning power, how much salary we make over time. And we also know that the more salary we make, the more taxes we pay. So from a sociological and social perspective, society wants us to go further in our education, to have better paying jobs, so that we can help society recoup the money that it has invested in us by providing that public education at least. And if things continue to go the way they are today in California, I am sad to say that 75% of children will pay less taxes over their lifetime in the future than it is what it took to provide them with a free public education. So as a matter of social survival, it is important for us to understand that we are going through an educational crisis at the moment. It is a silent crisis that we do not know much about. And unless we do something radically different, this is not the future we want for ourselves. That is economically speaking, of course. So we need a new perspective. And that is why we call on John Dewey, a great American educator, which said, if we teach today's students as we taught them yesterday, we rob them of yet tomorrow. If we keep doing things the same way we have done throughout this time, for the past 150 years, to our students today, we are not going to be preparing them for the future ahead. Here is a classroom picture. If we zoom into the picture for a little bit, we will see that it's about 100 years ago, but yet the classroom looks exactly the same as a classroom today. If we change the clothes on those students, you could think it's today's classroom. But yet, when we were 100 years ago preparing students, we prepared them for jobs that were very different than the ones we have today. We were preparing them to do different things, to do very manual labors, very repetitive things that did not really require interaction. And for those of you who are really young, this is the precursor of Uber. There's a chair right there. They would take you from point A, but then be without an app. You didn't have a lot of choice. And those of you who have cell phones, this is what we had before. You would place a call into the switchboard, they would connect you later and make your call possible. That's all you did. You just did this. It made sense at the time. But my point is here that maybe now that we are a little bit farther ahead, it makes sense for us to change the way we see things and do them differently. To individualize education, not just fill the bucket, but light a fire. So, what do we do then with this new perspective? Let's go back and let's revisit the word education, which is really composed of two Latin words, ex and ducere. And ex, I think we all know. Ex means out. And ducere means to lead. So education is the process of leading something out of ourselves. And that is very important because we should pause for a second to consider that there's some implications here. And the first implication is that there is an in and there is an out. There is an us and there is an outside world. So there is a social component to education. We must interact with others. At the same time, we also want to understand that to lead is not to force out, but to coach it. So there is the free will aspect. We have to want to learn to be able to learn. That is also very important. Another very important part to acknowledge here is that there is a potential within us that's already there. Otherwise, we couldn't take it out. So if we're taking something out, it's because it exists within, which means that all of us are capable of learning, without exceptions. And when we put that all into consideration, we know that learning happens when it comes from inside and goes to the outside world. When we do that, we learn. When we give, we receive. With that in mind, we want to call attention then to some coaches that can kind of help us rethink the way we go about an education system. You might have met all of them. I would like you to reintroduce you to Socrates. Socrates, a Greek philosopher in the 4th century before Christ, was considered the wisest man in the world by the Oracle of Delphi at the time because he admitted he did not know much. What is great about Socrates is his Socratic method. His teaching and learning method was simple. He would ask somebody to define what is it that they think they know. He would then engage in questions with them in a process called dialectics when we're talking to each other and asking questions. And then, by questions, he would lead that person to understand that they really didn't know as much as they thought they did. And they had to admit it, because without doing that, they couldn't then go back and redefine that which we knew. So through the process of questioning, we are able, with the ins and outs, with other people, to really validate and better frame that which we learn. And that is an important piece of our education. We need to consider that. It's important for us to engage with others, to find out what is it that we really know, to help ourselves by recruiting their attention so we can exchange ideas. So the gift of Socrates is one of dialectics, of conversation, of being together, of engaging and learning together. Another important educator as well is Lev Vygotsky. Vygotsky was a Russian psychologist that lived in the 19th century, and Vygotsky worked on developmental psychology. He was really interested in understanding how kids mature and how they develop and learn. And Vygotsky came up with a model that he called the zone of proximal development, which sometimes we call ZPD. And the zone of proximal development is a really interesting concept and a very simple one. Imagine the center circle, the dark circle. That represents everything that we can do by ourselves. These are things that we can do without any help. Then the bigger circle, the secondary circle there, is the things that we can do with somebody else's help. And the third circle are the things that we cannot do even if we get somebody else's help. So for instance, I can do some mental calculations in math by myself. I don't need anybody's help with that. If I want to go back and study some trigonometry and maybe do some algebraic equations, I might need somebody's help to point me in the right directions because I don't know how to do that. But if I try to tackle quantum physics by myself, not even with help would I be able to do it, because my brain is not there just yet. So what Vygotsky was really positing for us is that for us to properly learn, we need to operate in the zone of proximal development. That is to say, we need to always be in that area, close to what we know, but outside of our comfort zone, so that with guidance from others in that social process, we can stretch ourselves and learn something new. After getting some coaching from my algebraic tutor, I would then have mastered it, and my inner area would have increased, and now I can do that by myself. And my zone of proximal development is next. And the lesson then that Vygotsky leaves us is a very powerful and beautiful one, is that we should always try to work on our zone of proximal development, at our zone of proximal development. That is to say, we should embrace and tackle the things that we can do with the help of others. There is no point for us to tackle things beyond our possibilities, because that won't lead us anywhere. And that is a really powerful message for us too, because it should remind us that we have to have the patience to build on what we know, and with the help of others, grow that slowly, and that we will not be genius from one day to the next. Developmentally speaking, that is impossible. We cannot do that. So it's a really powerful lesson that Vygotsky leaves us too, that is important for us to know what to tackle and how to tackle and who to tackle it with. So far, so good? Seatbelt still on? Okay. So in that sense, besides Vygotsky, I also want to share with you the story of this beautiful educator, American educator, Anne Sullivan. Anne Sullivan was the teacher to Helen Keller. You might not have heard of Anne Sullivan. You might not even have heard of Helen Keller. But Helen Keller was a blind and deaf person who learned to speak with the help of Anne Sullivan and read, and became a fantastic spokesperson for the blind, and was able to raise awareness and change the lives of thousands, if not millions, back in the 19th century and early 20th centuries. And it is Helen Keller that tells us that Anne Sullivan was her miracle worker. It was what caused her to be able to accomplish everything, because Helen Keller's story is a very interesting one. At 6 months of age, she was committed by an illness that made her lose her sight and her ability to hear. At 6 months of age, when you have not yet processed the world, how do you live after that without seeing and hearing? You can't possibly communicate. Think about this for a second. How does one grow and communicate with others without seeing or hearing them? And for that matter, she could not speak, because speech is connected to hearing. You need to hear to be able to learn how to speak. So she did not see, she did not hear, she did not speak. Her parents had the fortitude of calling on the School for the Blind in Massachusetts and asking for a tutor to go to Alabama, where they lived, so maybe she could be taught something. Maybe she could be more manageable. Maybe she could sit at the living room table and not be as bothersome. And they called into action Anne Sullivan. And Anne Sullivan's story is an interesting one too, because Anne Sullivan also had a troubled childhood. Her mother died. Her father abandoned both her and her brother because he could not take care of them. They went into an orphanage. About 3 months later, her brother dies in the orphanage. She is also committed by an illness that makes her lose her sight. And in the orphanage, somehow she convinces them to send her to the school that she heard about in Boston so that she can learn how to sign. She goes to the school. She learns how to sign through lots of operations. She's able to recover some of her vision. And she graduates from that school and decides she's going to help those who cannot see. She goes down to Alabama, helps Helen Keller. Do you know how she did it? It's amazing. She would take Helen Keller's hand, she would put her own hand, and in Helen Keller's hand, make the different signs for the letters for that word, then have her touch the little things. An impossibly slow process to a kid that was 7 years of age, that could not communicate with anybody. Through sheer love, persistence, with time, she was able to make Anne Sullivan, Helen Keller, somehow understand that these were symbols that simplified words for these things that were out in the world. And she began to know how to spell them, how to write them, and how to communicate eventually and speak, not without a lot of effort. So the question that we have here is that our success is oftentimes predicated on those who have taught us. So the lesson that Anne Sullivan leaves to us is exactly that. Who is your Anne Sullivan? Who was there for you that when you were blind and could not see, grabbed you by the hand and taught you? Who helped you develop? And not only physically, but spiritually as well. It is similar to the role that our mentors and guides sometimes might have with us. When we're so blind and deaf to things of this world, and yet they are there for us every single day, taking us by our hands to make sure that we are able to move forward and bring from within us something great and something fantastic. That's a beautiful message. Who was your miracle worker? Who is your Anne Sullivan? We should thank them, because they've done a lot for us. So that is the lesson that we learned from Sullivan. There is another educator, though, that when we look at all of this, that we can kind of learn from. We learned with Socrates the importance of asking questions and acting socially. We learned with Vygotsky the importance of working at the right pace, with the right zone of learning so that we can grow. And we learned with Sullivan that we need help and we need to be close to that and learn by doing and by receiving. And that all works well for our physical lives. But we want to add a fourth educator to this. An educator famous at his own time, Allan Kardec, a French educator in the 19th century who codified Spiritism. And the reason why we put him here is because he helped us and remind us that our existence is not that just of the physical body. That learning for this life is not just enough because we have many lives. We knew this before, some of us, right, through time, but it was not readily available for everybody. But when he codified Spiritism, when the Spirit's book came out and the Medium's book, it made available to anybody that wanted this knowledge about the spiritual realm. It's a democratization of spirituality. You no longer needed to have a guru or a mentor or anything else. You could do this by yourself. And funny enough, he keeps the questions and answers of the dialectics that Socrates has. He also lets us work at our own pace, following the idea that Vygotsky reminds us of, that we need to kind of slowly build on what we do, and that's why it's deliberately structured in a certain way, which certainly could be a topic for another time. But Kardec then brings Spiritism, this progressive body of knowledge that helps us understand that our nature is something greater than our physical bodies, that we have an origin that's divine in nature and a destiny that's divine in nature that's beyond the physical body, and that there is, in fact, this interaction between both planes of life. So everything that we learn here today and in our lives not only prepares us for this lifetime, but it prepares us also for a myriad of lifetimes to come. And that is the predisposition that we should have in our minds when we think about education, when we start to connect education through love. Because love is this act of giving, but it's also this act of receiving. And another great thing that our knowledge of education gives us is the certainty that the things that worked for us in the past were great, but just like our classrooms sometimes need a shift, our teaching models need a shift to accommodate this new generation of souls that are with us. Our minds also need a shift. We also need to let go of the old ways in which we learned and embrace new ones if we want to move forward, because now we're at a different level. We no longer can accept the views that were imposed for us in the past, even though we're grateful for them because they have brought us here, but we need to trek forward. And one of the things that these views can do and that Spiritism is uniquely apt to do is to help us reevaluate the world around, to understand that the physical is not just it, that is a spiritual. And in fact, it can also do something greater for us. It can help us question the view that we have inherited of perhaps the greatest educator there ever was. For most of us, we have this view of Jesus that's still in a box, that it still has been handed down to us for whatever reason socially, perhaps from past lives, of a man suffering on a cross, of a religious figures, and he was none of that. And he was that too. He was the ultimate educator. In fact, he never claimed any title to himself, except that of teacher. If you look at John 13, he'll say, "You call me teacher and Lord, and rightly so, for that I am." That is the only time you will see Jesus accepting any kind of title. Because he thought of education on a bigger and larger perspective, like we ought to. He thought about it on an educational way that also inspires our spirit for many years and lives to come. And he always asked questions like the Socratic method. Who do you think I am? What do you want of me? He asked questions to force others to bring out their knowledge and their requests. He also did something else. He always spoke to people at their level of understanding. Almost as if to foreshadow the Vygotsky theory, he spoke to those close to him in plain language, And he spoke to those that could not understand the complexities of certain things in parables, so the stories could stick to them, so that when they were ready to learn, they would remember and be able to develop it at their own pace, always respecting them. What a beautiful, beautiful teacher. And he told us, too, that there were things that we were not yet ready to understand, but that he would come back and teach us, not through his own voice, but through another voice, when we were ready to. And today we are ready to see these things differently, the way they are. In a way, he's Vygotskian. But like Sullivan, he always served and taught anybody, even those who cannot see or hear spiritually. He dined with prostitutes and tax collectors, with lepers and rich people, with the young and the old, with the poor and the rich. No one was exempt from his teachings. He was inclusive by nature as a true teacher. And the greatest gift he gave us was to show that there is life after death. When we often think of him at the cross dying, we miss the point that he came back later to show us that life goes on beyond the physical body. That is the most beautiful symbolism this teacher can give us. He showed us the way. He came back as to tell us, look, I have won over the physical world. I have come back to show you that life goes on after the physical world. That you too will go on after the physical world, and that you will do great things. And I will now go ahead and prepare it all for you, as a good teacher does, so that when you are ready, you will come and will continue to learn great, fantastic things. Wow. And in the spirit of Passover, which has just happened this Friday, this beautiful passage in John 13 where he claims the title of teacher. It's a beautiful one that maybe we should review. They were in a Passover having dinner a little before he was taken and crucified. And amidst the dinner with all his disciples, he decides to take out his top garments, wrap a towel around his waist, put some water in a basin, and walk around and clean and wash the disciples' feet. And there he goes, one by one in front of him. And he gets to Peter, who's passionate but also very honest. And Peter says, "Are you going to wash my feet, master, teacher?" And he says, "You do not understand what I am about to do, but you will later." And Peter says, "I will not let you wash my feet." And Jesus says, "If you do not let me wash your feet, you will not have with me anymore." And Peter says, "Then wash my hands and my head too, teacher." Because he was so passionate about it. He wanted it. He just didn't want to see Jesus in that position of being a servant washing his feet. But Jesus then says, you don't need to wash your hands or bath, because you've taken a bath. Only your feet are dirty, and that I am going to wash. You have called me teacher and Lord, for that really I am. So listen to what I am telling you. What I do to you, you must do to others. And what a powerful example of the greatest teacher, the most knowledgeable soul that we have ever seen, has come to tell us the way to be happy. And in doing so, he humbled himself, showing that the way forward is through serving others. Because that is what matters. It is important for us to serve, and by serving and doing, we learn. So the act of education that we have ahead of our lives is that of doing things, and by doing, growing. As Francis of Assisi said, it is giving that you receive, because we learn. And the spirits have come back now to tell us on behalf of Jesus that it's important for us to change our preconception of everything we had before, to break into this realm of spirituality, to understand that the physical world and the spiritual world are not disconnected, that they're connected and they're one and the same, and that we are spirits having a temporary passage through the physical body. And what we learn here, what we do here, it's not just for our future, it's for our now. It's to make us happier and to understand that we have a great future ahead of us. What a teacher. What a teacher that keeps teaching us from a distance, even if not physically present. But now we've learned that physical presence is not necessary, That love goes on beyond the physical body, as did love incarnate go past the physical body, came back to tell us, just like the spirits do in a symbolic way, and went forward into the vastness of space, where we too will go. Wow, how beautiful. How great it is to be here today. How great it is to be alive, to be a spirit. Thank you. And in the spirit of thinking that way, it's always important to know that from love, we've come. We teach, we grow, we learn. We expand our hearts, our minds, our souls. We're never alone, young or old. From love, through love, back to love we go. Isn't that beautiful? Much love to all of you. I hope that you remember here, now, and always that there's always great love for you from God, from all of us, and that you are work in progress, that you are an immortal spirit that's going to do great things, and that everything you do affects everybody else. May God continue to bless you. Thank you.